It's a beautiful day. Jesus and his disciples are walking through Galilee. The birds are chirping, the flowers are blooming, the sun is shining. And then Jesus starts talking about his death. Again. We were just here last week. No one rebukes him this time. They learned that lesson last week, remember? When Peter took him aside and got a little scolding. So now they just listen quietly. They don't know why Jesus is so insistent on talking about his death. Every time he brings it up, which is getting more frequent, they give each other sideways glances as if to say, "This again?" This talk of death seems like such a distraction from important things like healing and feeding people. And frankly, it's a little creepy, a little morbid. They have a silent agreement with each other to not ask questions when he gets in this mode, to not encourage this kind of talk, to ride it out until he's done and they can move on to something better. Today, on this occasion, the something better, once he is done with this talk, is to discuss amongst themselves who is the greatest. Now, this is something they can really sink their teeth into. It's an engaging conversation. You might even call it an argument. When Jesus is king, it's like a game they play. When Jesus is king, who will be his right-hand man? Will it be, and of course it never enters their mind that it would be a woman. Who will be his right-hand man? Peter or John? Who amongst them? Today's equivalent would be, who will be, when Jesus is president, who will be the vice president? Who will be the chief of staff? I bet it was fun to imagine this alternate reality in which they had power and privilege. It helped them shake off that weird feeling they got when Jesus started in on the death talk. It also helped them forget their botched attempt at healing a boy. They wouldn't say it this bluntly. The disciples weren't the most self-aware guys in town, but they were feeling kind of vulnerable and anxious. They kept getting into situations where they felt out of their depth. What were you arguing about on the way? Silence. Awkward, avoiding eye contact. But he knew, of course Jesus knew, he knew that they were anxious and afraid. He knew that their brains were hardwired to respond to threats by fighting or fleeing or freezing. He knew that this was their way of fleeing, of running away from what they could not understand. It was their way of trying to beat back the threat that one day Jesus would leave them. He also knew that if they continued to live in fear, if they went down this road, if fear motivated their actions, they could not live out of love. Centuries later, the writer of 1 John would capture this well by writing, "There is no fear in love, But perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. What Jesus says here and now is, whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. In other words, it's not the one on the top whose insecurities drove them there, who lives in fear of being less than, who is to be praised. It is the one on the bottom who lives and acts out of love, who is willing to serve their neighbor, who is to be praised. These bottom dwellers, these humble ones, right? That word humble has the root hum, like humus, right? Humility, humus. And fifth grader knew what that meant. Anybody know what that means? On Wednesday, a fifth grader knew. Earth, humus, earth. So the humble ones are earth people. And they have discovered the richness of life that is not controlled by fear. It's not that they don't feel fear. It's that fear doesn't dictate what they say and what they do, how they respond. They feel it, they feel the fear, and they let it go. How do they do that? How do they feel the fear and let it go? How do you do that? Do you have any ideas? Any learnings? How do you feel fear but let it go? Do you take some deep breaths? Do you pray to center yourself? Do you consciously lean back into your chair, into God? Do you read scripture like we see in our psalm that reminds us, it is the Lord who sustains my life. Right? It is the Lord who sustains my life. Maybe you talk to some other humble ones, some other earth dwellers who are committed to not living out of fear. Jesus has a little suggestion for us today, something to add to that list of things, and that is to welcome children. Children have had less time to learn fear, right? We don't grow up, we're not afraid when we're born. We learn fear. And children have had less time to learn that. And so sometimes it helps to hang out with kids and watch how they move in the world. Watch how they feel fear, but they don't always act on it. To watch the way they love. I invite you this week to notice love and fear in your life. How and when do they impact your words and actions? How and when is fear impacting your behavior? And how and when is love impacting your behavior? And then I invite you, when you're feeling that fear, which, hey, we're animals, we're hardwired to feel that fear, to experiment with ways of feeling it and letting it go. And maybe the reminder is, it is the Lord, it is God, who sustains my life. You're held in God's hands. Amen.